Yes, it is, and welcome back. Wednesday, February 16th, 2022. I'm not sure people celebrating the ouster of 3 school board members in San Francisco are fully understanding the ground on which this battle took place, and thus what the victory is. First, yes, great job getting rid of those 3. The recall wasn't close, and hopefully messages will be sent for the good. But second, as you know, I always point out, don't rest on the laurels or engage in any self-satisfaction that this temporary victory is anything like the end of the problem or the beginning of a new Weltanschauung. There's an old Confucian saying, when you leap for joy, make sure nobody removes the ground below you. Too often, we think we won and thus have won everything. It isn't true with judicial appointments, and it isn't true with presidential elections, and it isn't true in Virginia, and it isn't true in San Francisco, which itself is a city steeped in leftism. One might say in the vote yesterday, the left hand slapped the far left hand. And slapped is the right word because the mainstream of the left there has far left currents running deeply throughout it. Let us understand first and foremost what all these education fights are about. The first thing in this understanding is to get what they are not about. And they are not about education, at least not for us. We think education is about teaching children what we were taught. How did William Wordsworth put it? What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how. Instruct them how the mind of man becomes 1,000 times more beautiful than the earth. That is what we think of when we think of education. We think of giving our children what we got: math, reading, science, history, writing. And occasionally we even delight when we see occasionally our children reading some of the same novels we were brought up on and taught. That's our view of education. This is not the modern or progressive or leftist view. They do not view education that way. They view education the way you could intimate from hearing of organizations like the Communist Youth League or the Socialist Youth League. The word is not education. The word is indoctrination and social change. Education means etymologically to lead forth. Indoctrinate means to imbue with an opinion, or as the word states, a doctrine. We view education as training children up to be ready for the world and to engage it with everyone else. They view it as training children to change the world, hence revolutionize it. It's much like what Karl Marx said about himself. Prior to him, he said philosophers attempted to understand the world. His task, he wrote, was to change it. And to the left, you start as all progressive youth leagues start with the children. Do yourself a favor. Search children's gender books. You'll be shocked, truly. Not that they exist, but how many there are. Just like, The Very Hungry Caterpillar and Harold in the Purple Crayon. But they're dedicated to promoting transgenderism. Way too many to count. It's its own industry now, not even a cottage industry. Let me try to quote one modernly fashioned education expert to try and help explain what we're getting at here. She is Cecily Mayart Cruz, and she is the president of the United Teachers Union of Los Angeles, which is one standard deviation to the right of San Francisco, to the right. When the debate over school openings was taking place last year, she was asked if she was worried over the learning loss nearly everyone knew our children had suffered from the COVID school closures. She said this, quote, "Our kids didn't lose anything. It's okay that our babies may not have learned all their times tables. They learned resilience. They learned survival. They learned critical thinking skills. They know the difference between a riot and a protest. They know the words insurrection and coup," close quote. Well, count me as one who believes in teaching vocabulary, though I'm not sure I'd start 8-year-olds with insurrection and coup, especially when in the context of 2021, those words were highly politicized. But that's our view, not theirs. Their view is it's never too early. And not when she says our kids didn't lose anything. She's saying our view of math and science and reading and the rest are irrelevant, so long as the kids were indoctrinated in other things, like what a riot is and what a protest is. But, caution, to them, January 6th was a riot. To them, The BLM actions, 30 people killed, buildings and businesses burned, police precincts taken over, federal courthouses firebombed, billions of dollars wrecked. Those are protests. This is but one illustration I'm speaking of, and if you look at the 3 San Francisco board members who were ousted, you see perfect mirroring. They were not working on getting kids back in schools or even educated from a distance or at home. They were interested in other things, like obliterating a mural dedicated to George Washington and the names of Abraham Lincoln and Paul Revere, after whom some of the schools were named. Washington, Lincoln, Paul Revere. That was the enemy during COVID and during the summer of 2020. Why would Washington and Lincoln and American founders be the enemies? Obvious, no? They were the most prominent names affiliated with America being worthy of itself, or just being America. And that's what needed to be chipped away at. Orwell put it that, quote, anything that was obviously of earlier dates was ascribed to some dim period called the Middle Ages. The centuries of capitalism were held to have produced nothing of any value. One could not learn history from architecture any more than one could learn it from books. Statues, inscriptions, memorial stones, the names of streets, anything that might throw light upon the past was systematically altered, close quote. One of the school board members was even known as an anti-Asian bigot to those who care about bigotry against Asians, which in our modern fashion is not a bigotry we are supposed to care much about, because some trick of cultural magic has placed Asians alongside Jews into the category of white, or rather, white oppressor. But it wasn't the taking down of Washington and Lincoln that really animated the San Francisco voters. That's just what the board members were up to when they weren't working to open the schools and improve virtual learning. You and I may care about the what these school board members were doing, like what I just said. Most San Francisco voters just cared that the schools weren't open, because to tell you the truth, what was being taught inside those bricks and mortar was, in fact, just as bad as what was going on in Virginia or too many schools everywhere else. It was about the schools not being open, not what was being taught in them when they were open or what board members were doing during the closure. So let's not celebrate too much too quickly. Nothing permanent was fixed yesterday. Here's what needs fixing, and Charles Kessler gives it to us in his new essay in the new issue of the Claremont Review of Books. Ronald Reagan, he writes, warned of the problem, then only a fist-sized cloud on the horizon 33 years ago in his farewell address. When Reagan said, quote, those of us who are over 35 or so years of age grew up in a different America. We were taught very directly what it meant to be an American, and we absorbed, almost in the air, a love of country and an appreciation of its institutions. And if you didn't get a sense of patriotism from your family and neighborhood, you got it from school and popular culture, close quote. That was Reagan in his farewell address. By the cusp of the 1990s, however, Kessler writes, something had changed for the worse. Reagan captured it in a single understated sentence when he said, quote, younger parents aren't sure that an unambivalent appreciation of America is the right thing to teach modern children, close quote. The children of those ambivalent parents have grown up and begun to have families of their own, usually with fewer children. The growing uncertainty about the country now extends in many cases to the second and third generation of her puzzled citizens. Is it any wonder that a nation torn between loathing and loving itself seems sometimes to be on the verge of a nervous breakdown? Kessler asks. The American people hardly know what to think about America anymore. Less than 3 years ago, he points out, the New York Times announced in its 1619 Project that American slavery was more fundamental than American freedom. Anti-black racism is in America's DNA, explained the project's organizer, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is black. Yet in the same condemning essays, she reconciled with her father, an Army veteran who had flown the American flag in his modest front yard every day of his life. I had been taught in school through cultural osmosis, Hannah-Jones wrote, that the flag wasn't really ours, that our history as a people began with enslavement, and that we had contributed little to this great nation, close quote. As a young woman, she felt ashamed that, quote, my dad felt so much honor in being an American, dismissing his patriotism as a marker of his degradation. Let me pause to note something important here. Note, she was taught her dad was wrong. In school. Back to Kessler. But the older, wiser Hannah Jones had somehow come to realize that her father had a point after all. She writes, "My father knew exactly what he was doing when he raised that flag. He knew that our people's contributions to building the richest and most powerful nation in the world were indelible." She draws the moral. "We were told once, by virtue of our bondage, that we could never be American. But it was by virtue of our bondage that we became the most American of all." Close quote. In some ways, it's a beautiful essay that can't abide the beauty of its own sentiments. It's the ambivalence, again. She knows her essay amounts, or could amount, with sufficient forgiveness for the undoubted evils in the American story, to a vindication of American patriotism. But she cannot, Kessler argues, bring herself to make the full-throated pledge of allegiance her father did, even though she is attracted to it and understands now why he made it. Like so many others, she cannot bring herself to believe in her country's principles, because it would be unsophisticated or politically incorrect to do so. So she is left with a paradox. How systemically racist can America be if its downtrodden are responsible for almost all of its political and moral progress? Though a small consolation, it's what keeps her analysis from veering into open anti-Americanism, where so many on the far left seem to want to go these days. Yes, all of this is true. So Hannah Jones does not veer into open Americanism. No need to. In a liberal, or perhaps the better word is open society, you can internally simply change things without a coup. This has always been the case. The open society is far more susceptible to revolution without blood or bullet than tyrannical societies that oppose open dialogue, critique, dissent, or even the vote. You don't have to state you hate America here. You can simply change what America is or means, first by distorting its present, and then going through slowly and surely and revising its past. For you know what? Somehow in all her learning, Hannah Jones finds it irrelevant, if not downright in need of ignoring and dismissing, that the free part of this republic defeated the slaveholding part, and operating as if the President of the United States from 1861 to 1865 was Jefferson Davis and not Abraham Lincoln, and that he was succeeded by Alexander Stephens and not Andrew Johnson and then Ulysses S. Grant. No need to do this openly. Just go after the kids, start with the children, and to do that, start with the schools. And pretty soon you get new generations, just as Charles put it, that have nowhere to go and nothing to oppose the revisionism that has now become catechism. So, seeing what can be done in San Francisco, of all places, we should understand what should be done everywhere else, and for the right and essential and fundamental reasons. Reasons that go to the purpose rather than simply to personnel.